There's a kind of person who moves through the world slightly out of sync with its rhythm. Not louder, not faster, just quieter. While everything around them rushes forward, opinions forming instantly, conversations jumping topics, reactions arriving before reflection, they pause. Not because they are unsure, but because too much is happening at once. They notice things other people miss. The way a sentence lands a little off, the shift in someone's tone halfway through a laugh, the feeling in a room that can't be explained but can definitely be felt. Their mind doesn't grab the first interpretation and run with it. It lingers, it compares, it holds multiple possibilities side by side, weighing them carefully before letting one speak. From the outside, this can look like distance, like hesitation, like someone who's not fully present. But inside, it's anything but empty. It's layered, active, constantly moving. If you've ever been told you're too quiet, too deep, or hard to read, chances are your mind doesn't fit easily into a world built for noise. You don't think in headlines. You think in paragraphs, sometimes in entire chapters that never make it out of your head. And that mismatch can be exhausting, because the world rewards speed, certainty, and instant clarity. But your mind was built for depth. And before we talk about why that is, before we label it as a strength or a struggle, it's important to understand this first. There is nothing wrong with a mind that moves slowly in a fast world. When people hear the phrase deep thinker, they often picture someone highly intelligent, analytical, academically gifted, quick with complex ideas. But that assumption misses something essential. Deep thinking isn't primarily about how smart you are. It's about how sensitive your system is. A deep thinker doesn't just process information, they absorb it. Sounds, expressions, emotional undercurrents, unspoken implications. Where others register events at face value, a deep thinker feels the weight beneath them. Meaning arrives before logic. Emotion precedes explanation. This is why two people can experience the same moment and walk away with completely different impressions. One notices what happened. The other notices how it felt, what it hinted at, what it might lead to. Deep thinking begins not in the intellect, but in perception. That sensitivity is neurological, not dramatic. Some nervous systems are simply wired to detect nuance more easily. They pick up subtle shifts in tone. They notice micro-expressions. They feel changes in atmosphere before words confirm them. And once something is felt, the mind gets involved, trying to understand it, organize it, make sense of it. This is also why deep thinkers are often misunderstood. Their reactions may seem delayed. Their responses may seem overly considered. But it's not because they're slow. It's because they're taking in more data. They aren't thinking harder than everyone else. They're sensing more. And when you feel more, you think differently. Not to complicate life, but to understand it well enough to move through it without losing yourself. Deep thinking rarely begins as a preference. More often, it begins as an adaptation. Many deep thinkers didn't grow up in environments where things were simple, predictable, or emotionally safe. They grew up needing to pay attention to moods, to silence, to what wasn't being said. When a room could shift without warning, awareness became protection. So they learned early how to watch. They noticed when a parent's tone changed, when tension entered the air, when it was better to stay quiet than ask for too much. They became skilled at reading between the lines, because the lines themselves weren't reliable. Understanding the emotional weather wasn't curiosity, it was survival. Often these children were praised for it. You're so mature for your age. You're easy. You don't need much. What sounded like admiration was often reinforcement. Being low maintenance kept things stable. Being observant kept them safe. Over time, their inner world grew rich, not because they were encouraged to explore it, but because they had nowhere else to put what they noticed. Thinking deeply became the place everything went. As they grew older, this habit stayed. Their mind kept scanning, connecting, interpreting. Not out of fear anymore, but because it had learned that depth equals safety. That understanding prevents pain, that seeing things coming makes them manageable. But here's the quiet cost of that conditioning. When you learn early that stability depends on awareness, it becomes difficult to ever fully rest. Your mind doesn't stop watching just because the danger is gone. It keeps listening for shifts, reading emotional signals, anticipating outcomes, long after it needs to. So deep thinking isn't just a trait, it's a history, a record of a nervous system that learned early how to stay alert, thoughtful, and inwardly occupied. And while that adaptation can later become insight, creativity, and wisdom, it also explains why so many deep thinkers feel mentally tired without knowing why. They weren't born overthinking life, they were trained to notice it. Inside the mind of a deep thinker, stillness is rarely empty. Even in quiet moments, walking alone, staring out a window, lying in bed at night, the mind keeps moving. Psychologically, this is tied to something called high trait introspection. It's the tendency to not only experience thoughts and emotions, but to observe them while they're happening. A deep thinker doesn't just feel sadness, they notice how it arrives, what triggered it, what it reminds them of, and what it might mean. Their attention naturally turns inward. At the same time, another system is active in the background, the brain's default mode network, or DMN. This network becomes more active when we're not focused on a task, when the mind wanders, reflects, remembers, or imagines. It's the same network involved in creativity, storytelling, and self-reflection. For deep thinkers, this network doesn't switch on occasionally, it hums constantly. That's why a single moment can spiral into a chain of associations. One comment leads to a memory. The memory leads to a question. The question leads to a pattern. Before they realize it, they're no longer in the moment. They're inside a web of meaning their mind is weaving automatically. These meaning loops aren't chosen. They happen because the brain is designed to connect, compare, and interpret. For a deep thinker, understanding feels like grounding. Making sense of things feels stabilizing. But there's a trade-off. When the mind is always searching for meaning, it can be hard to simply experience something without immediately translating it into thought. Rest doesn't feel like rest, it feels like open space the mind fills on its own. And this is where depth begins to blur into exhaustion. Not all deep thinking comes from the same place, and this distinction matters more than most people realize. There is a form of deep thinking that comes from curiosity, a genuine desire to understand life, people, patterns, and meaning. This kind of thinking feels expansive. It opens possibilities. Even when it's intense, it carries a sense of choice. But there is another form that looks similar from the outside and feels very different on the inside. Trauma-based thinking isn't driven by wonder. It's driven by vigilance. Here, the mind scans not to explore, but to prevent harm. It replays conversations to check for mistakes. It analyzes reactions to detect rejection. It imagines outcomes to avoid being caught off guard. The goal isn't insight, it's safety. Both types think deeply. Both analyze, both reflect. But one asks, what does this mean? The other asks, what could go wrong? The difference isn't intelligence, it's nervous system orientation. Deep thinking rooted in curiosity tends to feel alive, even when it's heavy. Trauma thinking feels tight, urgent, compulsive. The thoughts don't feel optional. They feel necessary, as if stopping would be dangerous. This is why some deep thinkers feel enriched by their inner world, while others feel trapped inside it, and many people live somewhere in between. A naturally reflective mind, shaped early by environments that required caution, can blur the line between depth and defense. What once kept them safe becomes a habit that no longer knows when to stand down. Understanding this difference isn't about labeling yourself. It's about recognizing whether your thoughts are serving your awareness or guarding your fear. Because healing doesn't mean thinking less. It means learning when thinking is no longer needed. Deep thinkers don't feel lonely because they lack people. They feel lonely because they live at a different pace. The modern world moves quickly. Opinions are formed in seconds. Conversations skim the surface. Certainty is rewarded, even when it's shallow. Speed looks like confidence. Simplicity looks like strength. And pausing to reflect often looks like hesitation. For a deep thinker, this creates a constant sense of being slightly out of sync. They don't arrive at conclusions instantly. They want to sit with ideas to feel their way into understanding. By the time they're ready to speak, the conversation has often moved on. So they stay quiet, not because they have nothing to say, but because what they want to say doesn't fit into sound bites. Over time, that silence becomes misunderstood. Others may read it as disengagement, aloofness, or lack of interest. But the truth is, deep thinkers are usually paying closer attention than anyone else in the room. They're listening not just to words, but to tone, timing, and what's being avoided. In a culture that prioritizes productivity over presence, depth can feel invisible. And when your way of relating to the world isn't mirrored back to you, isolation follows. Not dramatic loneliness, but a quieter kind. The feeling that few people really meet you where you live mentally and emotionally. So deep thinkers learn to adapt. They nod along. They simplify their thoughts. They keep the deeper questions to themselves. And the world never notices what it's missing. Deep thinkers don't fall into relationships casually. They enter them with meaning. Where others may bond through shared routines or surface compatibility, deep thinkers bond through interpretation. They listen closely. They remember details. They replay conversations, not to keep score, but to understand. Every interaction becomes a data point in a larger emotional pattern they're quietly mapping. This is why love feels so intense for them. They don't just experience affection, they analyze it. They ask where it comes from, what it signals, what it might become. A delayed reply isn't just a delay, it's a question. A change in tone isn't just a mood, it's information. And because they see layers everywhere, they invest emotionally long before they realize how deep they've gone. That depth can be beautiful. It creates attunement, empathy, and a rare kind of presence. But it also carries risk. Deep thinkers often assume others relate the same way they do. They expect honesty because they offer it. They expect consistency because they notice patterns. When reality doesn't match that expectation, the pain cuts deeper. Not because they're fragile, but because they've attached meaning to every thread. This is also why deep thinkers are more vulnerable to emotional manipulation. When someone is inconsistent, vague, or avoidant, a deep thinker doesn't immediately disengage. They search for explanations. They give the benefit of complexity. They assume depth where there may be avoidance. And by the time they realize the connection isn't mutual, they're already invested. Trust for a deep thinker isn't given easily, but once it's given fully. They don't love halfway. They open slowly but deeply. And when that depth isn't met, it can feel like losing not just a person, but an entire internal world built around them. For deep thinkers, heartbreak isn't loud, it's analytical, and it lingers in meaning long after the relationship ends. Depth becomes dangerous when it stops leading somewhere. For deep thinkers, reflection is usually a tool. It helps them understand emotions, extract meaning, and integrate experiences. But there's a point where reflection quietly shifts into something else, rumination. Rumination doesn't feel like overthinking at first. It feels productive, necessary, like you're close to an answer that will finally bring relief. So the mind loops. It replays the same conversations, revisits the same decisions, adjusts the angle slightly each time, hoping this version will make everything click. But nothing resolves. The difference between reflection and rumination isn't how much you think. It's whether the thinking moves you forward. Reflection creates insight. Rumination creates stagnation. One opens perspective, the other tightens it. For many deep thinkers, rumination is driven by a need for closure. If they can just understand why something happened, why someone pulled away, why a moment felt off, why a relationship ended, then maybe the emotional tension will release. But not every experience has a clean explanation. Some endings are incomplete. Some people don't know their own reasons. Some answers don't exist yet. And when a deep thinker keeps searching for certainty in situations built on ambiguity, the mind becomes trapped in its own depth. This is why rumination feels exhausting. It's depth without direction. The thoughts aren't revealing new insight. They're circling the same emotional territory, hoping repetition will turn into resolution. Learning to recognize this shift isn't about shutting the mind down. It's about noticing when thinking is no longer clarifying, but keeping pain alive in motion. The solution for a deep thinker is not to think less. It's to give thought somewhere to land. Many deep thinkers are told to get out of their head or stop overanalyzing, as if depth were a flaw to be corrected. But depth isn't the problem. Disconnection is. When reflection has no anchor in the body, in action, or in expression, it becomes heavy. Grounding is what turns depth into stability. For some, grounding happens through the body. Walking without headphones, feeling breath move in and out, letting physical sensation interrupt the mental loop. The body lives in the present, even when the mind doesn't. Returning to it gives the nervous system a signal of safety. For others, grounding comes through creation. Writing, music, art, anything that translates inner complexity into something external. When thoughts become form, they stop spinning. They settle. They make space. Connection can also be grounding, but only the right kind. Not constant stimulation, not surface chatter, but conversations where reflection is met, not rushed, where depth doesn't need to be defended. And sometimes grounding is simply allowing experience without interpretation. Letting a moment be pleasant without asking what it means. Letting sadness pass without analysing its origin. Feeling without immediately categorising. This can feel uncomfortable for deep thinkers at first. Meaning has always felt like control. Understanding has felt like safety. But presence offers a different kind of regulation, one that doesn't require answers. Grounding teaches the deep mind something essential. Not every moment needs to be processed to be survived. Some moments are meant to be lived. For a long time, deep thinkers believe the goal is to understand more, to think harder, to finally reach the insight that will make everything feel settled. But over time, something quieter begins to emerge. The resolution isn't more answers, it's fewer demands. Maturity for a deep thinker isn't about abandoning depth. It's about learning how to carry it without letting it pull you under. Depth was never meant to be a place to drown. It was meant to be a place to see clearly. When a deep thinker begins to heal, their relationship with thought changes. They still notice patterns, they still reflect, but they no longer chase meaning at the cost of presence. They learn that some questions are allowed to remain open, some emotions don't need immediate interpretation. Some moments are complete simply because they're felt. This is where peace enters, not loudly, not dramatically, but as permission. Permission to pause. Permission to not know. Permission to let life unfold without dissecting every turn. And from that place, depth becomes light instead of weight. If you're someone who's always felt a little out of step with the world, a little too aware, a little too thoughtful, there's nothing wrong with you. Your mind was built to notice what others pass by, to see beneath the surface, to bring meaning where there is noise. If this video felt like it put words to something you've been carrying quietly, you're not alone here. This channel is a space for people who think deeply, feel deeply, and are learning how to live gently with both. If you want more conversations like this, consider subscribing. And if this resonated, leave a comment. What part of this felt most familiar to you? Depth doesn't need to be hidden, it just needs room to breathe. Thank you for watching.